It's very hard to lie as a poet. I mean, I think, and still be a real poet. Something gets caught and you pick it out and you say, oh, that's baloney. That's not, I think the poet knows that whatever, okay, I've done this, I've done that. What can I do with that? What can I speak? And you see them trying to shape that sense into something. It may often be, for example, with Williams, okay, then get away from myself and talk about the people on the street. Talk about others. So that helps, okay, because you're not focusing on the self. The more confessional, it can really become, as with Lowell, for example, it can become a kind of dark hole.
Hey everyone, you're listening to Sacred and Profane Love, a podcast in which philosophers, theologians, and literary critics discuss how literature can help us think more deeply about love, happiness, and meaning in human life. As always, I'm your host, Jennifer Frey. I am a philosopher at the University of South Carolina and a faculty fellow at the Institute for Human Ecology at the Catholic University of America. You can find me on Twitter at Jen Frey, on Instagram at Professor Essa Frey, and you can also find this podcast on Twitter at EudaimoniaPod. Before I get to today's episode, just a few housekeeping items are in order. The first is that the Institute for Human Ecology underwrites this podcast, and I'm incredibly grateful for their support. The IHE is the nation's leading academic institute committed to research into the social conditions vital for human flourishing, a topic that is quite near and dear to my heart and to this podcast. To learn more about the IHE, you can go to their website, ihe.catholic.edu. And if you enjoy this podcast, please consider becoming a monthly patron. You can go to www.patreon.com/eudaimoniapod to sign up. For example, as a $10 patron, you can get a free digital subscription to either The Lamp or The Point magazines. I subscribe to both, and I think you should as well, but I'm also just very grateful to both for their sponsorship of this podcast. If you don't know, The Lamp is a bi-monthly lay-edited journal of Catholic letters. It's a magazine in the old-fashioned sense, witty, urbane, full of serious reporting, insightful opinions, squibs, oblique parodies, and arts coverage that draws our attention to those things that are true, good, and beautiful, whether they belong formally to the Catholic Church or not. If you want to learn more about The Lamp, please go to thelampmagazine.com. And The Point is a magazine of philosophical writing that embodies two distinct but complementary convictions. One, that humanistic thinking has relevance for contemporary life, and two, that our lives are full of experiences worth thinking about. The Point adheres to no specific political or social agenda. They simply want the examined life to be an everyday practice. Please check them out at thepointmag.com. All right, I'm pleased to get to episode 53 of the podcast, which is with the wonderful Paul Mariani, who has a new book of poetry out with Slant titled All That Will Be New. Paul and I talk about why he writes biographies of poets, what we can learn from the lives of poets, and we discuss the poetry of Robert Lowell, who is the subject of one of Paul's many fine biographies. As always, I hope you enjoy our conversation. Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Sacred and Profane Love. I am absolutely delighted this morning to be joined by Paul Mariani. Paul is the University Professor Emeritus at Boston College, specializing in modern American and British poetry, religion and literature, and creative writing. Mariani has lectured and given readings widely in the United States and abroad, and has published over 250 essays, chapters in anthologies, scholarly encyclopedias, and reviews, as well as being the author of 20 books. These include biographies of William Carlos Williams, John Berryman, Robert Lowell, Hart Crane, Gerard Manley Hopkins, and Wallace Stevens. His biography of Williams was a finalist for the National Book Award. And he has published 8 volumes of his own poetry, including a brand new volume of poetry, with the title of which is All That Will Be New. Welcome to the podcast, Paul.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, it's a real honor to have you on the podcast. I was actually introduced to your work. You gave a lecture at the University of Chicago through the Lumen Christi Institute on Wallace Stevens. And that was my introduction to you and your work. It was such a great lecture. And yeah, I'm just excited to have you on. You are a biographer, but you're also a poet. Do you want to talk about your new volume of poetry, All That Will Be New?
Yes, Jennifer. This is the second volume in 2 years that I've published. The other one was Ordinary Time. Both volumes were published by Greg Wolfe at Slant. This All That Will Be New is a kind of blessing somehow. The poems just kept coming and coming and coming, and I was able to get this done in about 6 months or so. A lot of them are what we call ekphrastic poems, that is, poems that deal with meditations on paintings, okay? That was one thing. Also, meditations that I did on poets who have passed that were important to me. Alan Mandelbaum and Philip Levine are two of them. And then, of course, the poems that speak, there's William Carlos Williams, of course. That's where I get the title. And, of course, all of this within, if you will, a kind of Catholic tradition, which is the underlying thing that holds the poetry together for me. So that's what you've got here, these 2 volumes, yeah.
Can I just ask for you what it means to do poetry in the Catholic tradition? Does that sort of mean the spirit behind which you're writing the poetry, sort of it's animated by faith and hope and charity, or is it more about the topics that you're writing on?
Yeah, well, I see poetry as a gift that was given to me, okay, early on. And for me, I suppose at the heart of it is that Catholic vision, that spiritual, religious vision, which animates it from the beginning. The poetry, how do I shape that poetry? Well, that's why I did the poets that I did. Every one of them, I was looking not only to write their lives, but to see what they could teach me in terms of my own poetry. I could go through each of them. Actually, way back, it was Robert Lowell, okay? And it was because as a young Catholic myself, I was looking for a voice that had been there, that was attempting to work in that tradition. And I've always had a love for Gerard Manley Hopkins. He's probably, he is at the heart of it all. But then I said, okay, how do I find Hopkins, this 19th century Victorian Jesuit? How do I transfer him into 20th century American poetry? And the one that came to mind, the one that came up early on when I was in my early 20s, 20 years old, was Robert Lowell. And it was because there was a period in Lowell's life when he became a Catholic convert during World War II. And the impact that had on me, I said, what can I learn from Lowell? How many Catholic poets are there in the 20th century that I can, Americans that I can turn to? And there really were not a lot, to be honest, that I knew of. And Lowell's Quaker Graveyard in Nantucket, which he wrote during the war, owes so much to the Record der Deutschland by Gerard Manley Hopkins. And so I went to work not only in terms of the poetry, but who was this man? What was it that, here he is from a Boston Brahmin Episcopal background. Not that Episcopalianism seemed to be very central to their lives. And he becomes a Catholic convert early on. And I said, whoa, how did this, where's this going? And so I began to follow Lowell. And of course, what happened was that Lowell dropped away from that. He and Flannery O'Connor had been close friends. And I love Flannery O'Connor's work. And, just looking at what Flannery O'Connor was able to achieve in her years, And Flannery, you can see how she becomes very sad as Lowell drops away in his poetry from that Catholic tradition, leaves it behind in a poem called Crossing the Alps. And where does it lead? It goes crossing the Alps, in which he leaves, he says, because of the declaration in 1950 of Pope Pius XII's dogma of the Assumption of Mary. And he says, I can't go there. I can't go there. And so he crosses the Alps from Rome and the Vatican, and his Catholic vision moves westward to Paris. And
let me, sorry, just to interrupt for 1 second, because I want to dwell on early Lowell for a bit before we get to his kind of, post-Catholic, more postmodern turn, because I think in order to try to puzzle through why he leaves Catholicism, we first have to understand why he becomes Catholic in the first place, because prima facie, it doesn't really make sense. He's from an upper class Episcopalian, blue-blooded Boston background. So not only is Catholicism religiously not where he should be, but it's socially taboo. I mean, he's basically being a class traitor. So why does he do it in the first place?
Boy, you could ask the same question about Hopkins, who's a very, from his own, Anglican background, and he knows it's going to cause a lot of problems, not only with his family, but with his place in society. And the same thing happens with Lowell. Lowell uses Hopkins, I think, as a model. I've got to go there. There's just something about this vision that I have to follow. And I think, it's so interesting to watch his relationship to the Blessed Mother, because at the heart of A Quaker Graveyard, which is written during the war, World War II, you have this section on the Walsingham Way, on the pilgrimage in England to a site that was central to Marian, those who followed our Blessed Mother. Okay. So Lowell follows this. It's not easy for him, and he's a man who at one point is going to daily mass. He's a man who refuses, on Fridays to even smell meat, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And then I think. He's also unstable. He doesn't, not that he's had the manic breakdown yet, but it's there. It's in his system. And at a certain point, he just feels, I can't do this anymore. I can't do this. And so he moves more towards a secular vision, but that doesn't mean that he's still not thinking about what he's left behind. It's too embedded in him to leave it, to just forget about it. And so you find him at one point he was thinking of Jonathan Edwards, doing this biography of Jonathan Edwards. So that religious sensibility is very, very important to him. Even when he translates Baudelaire, you can still see the same thing. At the heart of it is the vision, the dark vision, but still a Catholic vision. And then at times he will slide back to it. But he's married once, then he's married a second time, then he's married a third time, and his own life. And he's spending a lot of time in McLean's and other hospitals, just Whitney, and then he will recover and he'll try to move forward. Where do I go next? And you find he has to write about everything, everything before him. He even says, okay, maybe at one point, if I write about the history of the world, maybe I'll find my answers. Well, it doesn't happen either. So I would say in the beginning for me as a poet, Lowell was very, very important. I only met him once. In the mid-'60s with Randall Jarrell. And he was already kind of in a fuzzy state at that point. But that was where it began. It began with Lowell. And then if I can just shift just for a second.
Sure.
Okay. Then I find that Lowell is talking about a poet named William Carlos Williams. And I start following William. And the thing about Williams is he's writing in what they call the American idiom, in a language very close to my own language, okay? Because Williams is from New Jersey, so I'm from New York. I can hear, when I hear his rhythms, I say, yes, this is my language. And Lowell, it was the same thing with, I found that Lowell himself was attracted to Williams. And then there's his biography, Paterson, and my mother was from Paterson. I said, what? Someone wrote an epic about a filthy swill hole like Paterson, New Jersey, and I spent, 10 years with Williams. So they keep moving me, what can I learn from Williams? What can I learn from Lowell? What can I learn from Berryman, et cetera, all the way through? Yeah.
Yeah. So I think most of our listeners know that you are very famous for your biographies of poets. I think the one on William Carlos Williams was the one that was shortlisted for the National Book Award. What draws you to that genre of biography? Is it because you think it better helps us understand the poetry, or is it something else?
At a certain point, I'm writing poetry, and I'm also, as a professor, teacher at UMass and then at Boston College. I'm, writing criticism, et cetera, reviews, things like that. But at the heart of it, I want to write poetry. That's at the heart of it all. But at the same time, I can't write poetry all the time. So what am I going to write? I'm not going to, I was never interested in writing a novel. So what's the next best thing to a novel? And that became the biography. I can tell a story, and it'll be a true story insofar as I can get all the facts and get that down. And then to watch, I'm in my 20s and I'm in my 30s, my 40s, my 50s, et cetera, and on and on. What can these poets teach me? What can they teach me about their lives? How is their poetry integrated with the lives that they lived? And that was something that I found absolutely fascinating. But at the same time, I was saying, but also, what can I learn about the art of poetry from what each of these poets did? How can I integrate their voices into my own voice? Or voices, maybe.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. So I want to focus on Lowell for this episode, in part because I just don't know very much about Lowell, and I'm just excited to learn more about him from you. But also, I'm also very into Flannery O'Connor, and I know that for a while they were friends. I think they kind of drifted apart. But Lowell's such an interesting case because he was such a difficult person. So he's not someone that I think is particularly admirable. He, I think, treated his wives pretty horribly. I think he was a pretty selfish man. And maybe that was, but it's complicated because he had some very severe mental illness, in particular, some very severe, I guess, bipolar disorder. And I think, wasn't he also diagnosed with schizophrenia for a time?
Yes, he was diagnosed with bipolar. He took lithium for a while, but you make a very good point. One of the things that I kept looking for is how are these male poets treating their wives? How are they treating women? And that was something that I had to learn from myself in my own life. Lowell was tough on his wives. He was. And you can say, well, yeah, but he was bipolar. Whatever it was not easy living with Lowell as a wife. The same, Williams was married to the same woman all of his life, but there were a number of infidelities as well, and I had to look at those. Stevens remained faithful to his wife, but it was a terrible relationship. He was absolutely adored her, when she was a young woman. But she also had claustrophobia. She was xenophobia, and she drifted apart. But Stevens, because of what he'd been through, the fact that his own parents wouldn't go to the wedding when he got married, said, I'm sticking with this woman no matter where it goes. So, but that's not an ideal either. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So, of course, Hart Crane is, is a gay poet, and he has various relationships with sailors. At the end, he has one relationship with a woman, and then he commits suicide. As you go through these lives, you have to pick up, where did it go? Where did the poetry help? Where did the poetry help not only them, but how does it help us as we read that poetry? What is it, the deepest, what shall I say, the deepest impulse, the deepest sense of communicating with others and to share that with others? And that's something that I think the poet wants to do.
I can definitely see for Lowell in particular, given how sort of confessional and autobiographical so many of his poems are.
Yes.
Why learning about his life is going to help us have a deeper appreciation of his poetry. I totally see that. The worry that I have, or maybe just the question that I have, is the more we learn about the kind of unsavory aspects of his life, the more likely we are to maybe distance ourselves or question some of that poetry. Or sort of, it becomes more difficult for us to disentangle like the things that we don't appreciate about him from the things that we really do appreciate. Yes. And I just wonder how, as his biographer, you kind of straddle that line.
Whoa, yeah, Jen, believe me, it came up again and again. As I'm writing the life, I'm saying, please don't go there. Don't do that. That's going to be a big mistake, and sure enough, it turns out to be a big mistake. And you see it again and again. And in each of the lives, except maybe for Father Hopkins, that's a different take. You see them, poetry becomes, it's a way of articulating, trying to make sense of their own lives. And it's very hard to lie as a poet. I mean, I think, and still be a real poet. Something gets caught and you pick it out and you say, oh, that's baloney. That's not, I think the poet knows that whatever, okay, I've done this, I've done that. What can I do with that? What can I speak? And you see them trying to shape that sense into something. It may often be, for example, with Williams, okay, then get away from myself and talk about the people on the street. Talk about others. So that helps, okay, because you're not focusing on the self. The more confessional, it can really become, as with Lowell, for example, it can become a kind of dark hole. With Hart Crane, you often find a sense of incredible praise. It's funny to see Hart Crane in the Brooklyn Bridge, and his model is the Virgin Mary. I just find that fascinating. He's looking for an ideal image of a woman is what he's doing. Oh, by the way, mothers have a real impact on the poets, that's for sure. And it's something that doesn't go away. I've just been reading Lowell's memoirs that have just come out, and you see him working, trying to figure out what to do with his mother, because his mother is pretty much dominating his own father. Okay, so there's that problem. And so the real male model is his grandfather, his mother's father. And it's something that sticks with him all the way through his life. With Hart Crane, the same thing. It's the strong mother. And how do you deal with that? And well, one way was, he moves away from women. That's what he did. With Stevens remains absolutely, as far as I can tell, as far as we know, faithful, but also he's living with an imaginary woman in his mind, an imaginary ideal. Okay, that's how he deals with it, as he does his work as an insurance executive. Lowell, 3 wives, a number of affairs. John Berryman, same thing. 3 wives, a lot of affairs. Alcoholism is another thing, okay? And then suicide. So I'm trying to learn what I can from them without quite following that path, Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I read this statistic in the New Yorker. There was I like going through the New Yorker archives, sort of a hobby of mine. So I went through the archives. I just searched Lowell to see what would come up.
Okay.
And there was an old article, like a book was written about how his mental illness affected his poetry. And sort of an interesting fact came out of this article. And that is that individuals with bipolar disorder are overrepresented in the writing professions and in poetry in particular, right? So the reviewer of this book is sort of who is a poet himself, is sort of talking about this fact and asking the question, okay, well, is it the mental illness that is the muse or the driver of the poetry? Like, would he not have been such a great poet if it weren't for the mental illness? Like, how do we think about it? It's a fascinating article. I mean, ultimately, the author comes out and says, well, no. I mean, it had to have been an impediment because poems, right, are art, right? And so they have this unity that reflects, reason. I just wonder what you think, given what you just said about all the poets that you've spent so much of your life studying.
The bipolar aspect actually drives Lowell, for example, into silence. There's nothing. And he knows that. And as he recovers himself, he needs something that he can turn to help bring back a sense of the world, a sense of the real world, and that becomes the poem. So it's not while he's in the bipolar, but as he comes out of it, that there's this struggle, and it's really, I think, an heroic struggle. Okay, I've got to get better. How can I do that in my language? And so he will talk about the bipolar, difficulties. There's no doubt about it. There are a lot of poems about that. But the thing is, how do I struggle? How do I get back so that I can actually articulate, so that I can actually write a line, then 2 lines, then 5 lines, etc. And I think really at a certain point when he came to write history, it was a matter of almost like a homework book for him. Get this sonnet done, this blank verse sonnet. Now get another one done. Okay, start with Adam and Eve and move up to the 20th century. That was not that I don't find myself attracted centrally to those poems. I find myself attracted to the earlier poems and then the poems in life studies and for the Union Dead. But that's the way that Lowell was developing. Yeah. Right.
One thing that really impresses me about Lowell is his erudition. So he's incredibly erudite. He knows this tradition. He knows the literary tradition and takes it very seriously. Something that was a little bit more unclear to me was the extent to which he knows kind of the philosophical or theological tradition that a lot of this poetry would have been taking for granted. Do you know if he had much of a theological or philosophical mind?
You mean Lowell?
Yeah.
Yes. Well, I think early on, I don't find him, it's a good question, Jennifer, because I don't find him reading or referring to the theologians, in any kind of depth like you do with, say, Hopkins or others, and that may be a problem in terms of the writing, of 20th century and 21st century poetry. Who do you go back to? And it seems that those who can go back to the Church Fathers, for example, to the Mother Seton, I find myself attracted to her, to the various saints, women, and men. That personally is what I'm searching for, what also gives a sense of something that's missing for me in a good deal of poetry. It's just not there. So, but that puts me, in a sense, you can say, well, you can just dismiss him then because, we're not really interested. This is a post-Christian period or whatever you want to say. But that's not me. I mean, that's not where I am. For me, it's still the logocentricity, the Christian perspective, but broadened. I mean, I find myself reading the Jewish writers, religious writers of all sorts, but it's more like Merton. Not that I think Merton is a first-rate poet. That's just not my feeling. I think he's much better with his prose.
Uh-huh.
But still, there's a model there, and it's a model that's we need. Honestly, we need it, and you'll see a certain number of writers. Dana Gioia, for example, dealing with this issue. So we just keep on trucking, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, one reason that I asked about, to what extent he was animated by theological questions, for example, is just, again, trying to make sense of his conversion and then his stepping away. Because it sort of struck me just reading your wonderful biography of him, which I haven't mentioned yet, but it's called Lost Puritan, A Life of Robert Lowell. It seemed to me that the whole thing was more affective or emotional than it ever was intellectual. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. It comes down to the heart as well. You've got to get the heart in there. Otherwise, it's just a lot of words, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, as an academic, I hear all these long talks and, you get bored after a while. Personally,
Indeed.
I'm looking for, okay, what's at the heart of it? Some of my closest friends just never got there. They always were questioning me about my own Catholicism, my own faith. Mm-hmm. But that's what's at the heart of it for me. And I'm just that's the road I've been going down for 80 years. Yeah.
Yeah. I sort of just have this sense that for Lowell, he went into Catholicism so gung-ho and so, he just literally threw himself into it. And I think he just got exhausted. I mean, I just think it was sort of not working for him. He was exhausted. He was having all these mental struggles, and he just sort of had to move on.
That's very well put, Jennifer. I agree. It was like the will, and he does get exhausted. If he could have somehow let it just integrate into him more quietly.
Yeah.
It would have been obviously, but at the end of his life, he speaks to about our Blessed Lady. He says, I miss her. He says, I miss her. Mm-hmm. So he does come back to it, but there's just so much of that kind of strong willpower that you get with certain modern philosophers, the will, as being central.
Right.
But it's also a sense of letting go, a sense of letting God, letting something larger than yourself get in there and move you. lead you.
That's right. The life of grace, right? It's not the life of pure autonomy. And it's giving up, some of that control. But I just, I mean, my sense is for him, it really wasn't an intellectual thing. And I think also he was obviously a man for whom living an integrated life was a very difficult thing, right? This is not a person who is well integrated spiritually. I have a question about how his poetry changes over his life and sort of like how you see his style changing and what your sense is of that trajectory over time. Because again, you read a poem like The Quaker Graveyard in Nantucket, which is a wonderful poem. It's really, it just grabs you, and it's so good. It's also deeply religious, and it's not surprising that he wrote it when he was Catholic. But then you look at some of his later poems, and it's a very different vibe. So I just wondered if you could speak about his progression as a poet and his changing style.
Yes, Jen. Early on, I find that he's listening to the Southern Fugitives, and there's a strong rhetorical basis to that, to their poetry, and Lowell is picking up on that. He's also finding in Hopkins's Record of Deutschland something of that same magisterial Baroque quality. Then in 1954, Jen, he has a serious breakdown, and he begins to write prose. He tells his publisher, I'm going to be writing prose from now on. And I'm going to write a memoir. I'm going to write my life. And you can see him, where did I come from? Who were my parents? Who were the teachers? And so he goes through that, and he writes over and over, and then he'll revise it, and then he'll go to the next chapter, and well, what about my grandfather Winslow? How much of an impact did he have on me? How much of an impact did he have on my mother? So in other words, it's a deep, if you will, kind of self-analysis that he's going through. And he does this for 2 years. Then he says, no, I'm going back to poetry. But when he goes back to poetry now, it's quite different from the poetry he was writing just a decade before. It's much closer to a language like William Carlos Williams's. It's a language that you can pick up and you can go with. You can read it, and you can understand it a lot faster than you could with the earlier poetry, which was more, as I say, Baroque. And so you get poems like Crossing the Alps, and you get poems like Skunk Hour. In Skunk Hour, for example, he knows his mind isn't right, but he tells us that just like that, my mind's not right. We know where he's going. So you find him moving more and more into a poetry that is poetry, but the syntax is closer to a contemporary American syntax. That continues, and then it goes perhaps too many poems, personally, I think. But that's how he develops, yeah.
Do you have a favorite period of his? Was there a time at which you think he sort of peaked?
Yes, I do. I would say the period from the Crossing the Alps to Skunk Hour, that volume, and then
would that be Life Studies?
Yes, Life Studies, yes. And then the next volume, For the Union Dead. Those are the two that I find are central to my understanding and what I like most about Lowell. Yeah.
Well, is there a particular poem that you would like to discuss in some detail? Because I think that it would be wonderful if we could sort of go through on how to read a Lowell poem, because he's not a poet that, for me anyway, you can just read and completely understand. I mean, you can hear it and you can hear that it's beautiful, but I think you have to kind of step back and really think pretty hard about what he's trying to do with a lot of his poems.
In life studies, you have not only the poems, right, but you have that long part 2, which is the 91 Revere Street, which is the prose section. But as far as the poetry, suppose I find what's most helpful here, Jen, is the opening poem, which is Beyond the Alps, and then the final poem, which is Skunk Hour. Those are the two.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, do you want to start with Beyond the Alps? On the train from Rome to Paris, 1950?
On the train from Rome to Paris, 1950, the year Pius XII, you find the dogma of Mary's bodily assumption. Reading how even the Swiss had thrown the sponge in once again, and Everest was still unscaled, I watched our Paris Pullman lunge mooning across the fallow alpine snow. Oh, bella Roma! I saw our stewards go forward on tiptoe, banging on their gongs. Life changed the landscape. Much against my will, I left the city of God where it belongs. There the skirt-mad Mussolini unfurled the eagle of Caesar. He was one of us only, pure prose. I envy the conspicuous waist of our grandparents on their grand tours. Long-haired Victorian sages accepted the universe while breezing on their trust funds through the world. When the Vatican made Mary's Assumption dogma, the crowds at San Pietro screamed, "Papa!" The Holy Father dropped his shaving glass and listened. His electric razor purred. His pet canary chirped on his left hand. The lights of science couldn't hold a candle to Mary risen at one miraculous stroke, angel-winged, gorgeous as a jungle bird. But who believed this? Who could understand? Pilgrims still kissed St. Peter's brazen sandal. The Duce's lynched, bare-booted skull still spoke. God herded his people to the Côte d'Ivoire. The costumed Switzers sloped their pikes to push, O Pius, through the monstrous human crush. Our mountain-climbing train had come to earth. Tired of the querulous hush-hush of the wheels, the blear-eyed ego kicking in my berth lay still, and saw Apollo plant his heels on terra firma through the morning sky. Each backward wasted Alp a Parthenon, fire-branded socket of the Cyclops' eye. There were no tickets for that altitude once held by Hellas. When the goddess stood, prince, pope, philosopher and golden bow, pure mind and murder at the scything prow, Minerva, the miscarriage of the brain. Now Paris, our black classic, breaking up like killer kings on an Etruscan cup. So there's the poem, Jen. You can see him leaving Rome. He likens Pius XII and the proclamation of the dogma in 1950 of the Assumption of our Blessed Mother. And he says, well, then you also, you have Pius XII, but you also had Mussolini, So I'm leaving that behind. But what's he going to? He's going to something just as darker, for example. And in the meantime, he thinks back to the myths of the Greek gods and goddesses, and likens Mary to Minerva, in that sense. But he's leaving it behind. But you can see the anguish in the poem. that he feels as he leaves it behind. Against my will, he says, I left it behind. So there's the opening of Life Studies, yeah.
Yeah, it's such an arresting poem, and I have so many questions about it. My first question is about why he brings up Mussolini. So, I mean, historically, Mussolini makes this famous political deal with Pius IX, creating the Vatican City so that the Pope is no longer, quote unquote, a prisoner in the Vatican. And in exchange for the creation of Vatican City and this, autonomy, like Pius IX kind of decides like he's not going to be as critical of Mussolini as he had been. But this is all, kind of prior to Pius XII. I mean, Pius XII is like a papal nuncio at this point. But why is he is he bringing up Mussolini to just kind of, why is he doing that? Is it to discredit the moral authority of Pius XII and sort of like how compromised the church has been politically, or what's the purpose of that?
I think he's at this point, he's already, by the way, by the time he writes this poem, it's not 1950, it's like 1956, okay? And he's looking back to the time he left. A lot of things have happened in his life, but he just can't, politically, as a Lowell, as an American, he can't follow what he sees as the autocracy of the Vatican. He thinks he has to leave that behind. The Switzers, for example, the Swiss Guard with their pikes. So, in other words, when it comes down to it, he says that if you look at it, he says it's no different from any other autocracy. But it's interesting that line that he uses to describe the Blessed Mother like a gorgeous jungle bird. The image of Mary now ascending, the paintings that you get. I mean, as though that really caught the reality of what this was. No, it doesn't, but that's what he uses. And then, of course, the jungle bird on the one hand, and then what? The little canary on his arm. So Pius is really, Pius XII is diminished as a figure here. But then what does he have to replace it? Killer Kings on an Etruscan cup. So, you see what he's doing historically. He's looking at the whole thing from, say, Homer or before up to the present. And essentially he's saying, in terms of history, nothing has changed. There's nothing special here that I can find, which is why I'm crossing the Alps now and the Cyclops and going from, on the Pullman back, back to Paris. I feel, quote, somehow more comfortable with that than I did with the church. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I was going to say, it's funny because, one of the reasons why it's such a great, arresting poem is that it's not setting up like a false dichotomy. It's not saying, well, it's either faith or science, or it's either progress or, progress or popes. I think he's more conflicted about it, but there is still this idea that, who can believe this stuff, right? Yes. Who could possibly believe it? And don't tell me to believe it just because of this guy's authority.
Yes.
And that was what really struck me the first time that I read it, is because I was thinking about all of the centuries long theological debates over this question of the Assumption and the actual need for someone to finally say, this is actually what we think about this, because people have disagreed. And, Pius XII is just coming out and saying, no, we have good theological basis for this, scriptural basis, etc.
But he doesn't go there, does he, Jen?
No. And I think that's kind of connected to the fact that it's just not theological for him. Is he aware in any sense of the debates between, say, Aquinas and Scotus on this? I very much doubt it.
Jen, I want to read the second poem because I want to show you where he winds up, because this is it. This is where he winds up.
Is this
now,
Skunk Hour?
This is the last poem in the volume. It's called Skunk Hour, and it's for Elizabeth Bishop. We haven't talked much about that relationship, but the letters comprise hundreds and hundreds of pages. They've been published.
Yes, the two major Elizabeths of his life. There were two major Elizabeths in his life. His wife, Elizabeth Hardwick, who was an incredible writer and critic in her, in her own right. Yes. And then Elizabeth Bishop, who I think he admired so much as a human and as a poet.
Absolutely, yes. This time, where is he? He's in Maine on Castine Island up there, Castine Nautilus Island up in Maine on a vacation, and he has seen, he had seen Elizabeth Bishop recently, but he had, in a sense, come on to her, and she is gay, so that there was that difficulty, of course. But he felt a deeper, he did feel this all his life as a strong attraction to Elizabeth Bishop for her mind, etc. But in Skunk Hour, look where it ends. Nautilus Island's hermit, heiress, still lives through winter in a Spartan cottage. Her sheep still graze above the sea. Her son's a bishop. Her farmer is first selected in our village. She's in her dotage. Thirsting for the hierarchic privacy of Queen Victoria's century, she buys up all the eyesores facing ashore and lets them fall. The season's ill. We've lost our summer millionaire, who seemed to leap from an LL Bean catalog. His 9-knot yawl was auctioned off to lobstermen. A red fox stain covers Blue Hill. And now our fairy decorator brightens his shop for fall. His fishnets filled with orange cork, orange, his cobbler's bench and all. There is no money in his work. He'd rather marry. One dark night, my Tudor Ford climbed the hill's skull. I watch for love cars. Lights turn down. They lay together hull to hull, with the graveyard shelves on the town. My mind's not right. A car radio bleats. Love, oh careless love. I hear my ill spirit sob in each blood cell, as if my hand were at its throat. I myself am hell. Nobody's here. Only skunks that search in the moonlight for a bite to eat. They march on their souls up Main Street. White stripes, moonstruck eyes, red fire under the chalk dry and sparse spire of the Trinitarian Church. I stand on top of our back steps and breathe the rich air. A mother skunk with a column of kittens swills the garbage pail. She jabs her wedge head in a cup of sour cream, drops her ostrich tail, and will not scare.
Yeah, so there's a lot going on there, a lot to unpack.
There he is, Dan, crossing the Alps, and now he's standing. Where is he standing? On the back steps of his porch. That's the height that he's reached. And he's watching a skunk, mother skunk, as wedges her head into the jar of garbage. And he says it, my mind's not right. He knows where he is. And again, then notice there's that whole backdrop, that Boston Brahmin backdrop in the Victorian heiress. We saw it, with the Victorians in the opening poem, his parents, his world. Not that they've given him anything that he can really use. Desolate, empty. What does he have? what vision, what does he come away with? He's left the out. What does he come up with? A mother skunk that won't scare. There's something. I can hold on to something, even if it's just will, even if it's just garbage. And that ends the volume.
Yeah, it's very, it's very confessional.
Yeah.
And it's kind of depressing.
Absolutely. Yeah. See, that's, yeah, that's it. Yes, it is.
Yeah. So we're going to have to close this out given the time. So my last question is, and then I can just invite you to say, if there's anything else you want to say about Lowell for our listeners, please do. But my last question is just about his place in American letters. You know, what kind of impact do you think he made on American poetry? What's his legacy? And sort of, you know, why should we still read him?
Well, the confessional mode, I think, a lot of poets have picked up on that confessional mode. His own students, for example, Anne Sexton, Sylvia Plath, he and Berryman were close, and they both deal with the confessional in different ways, but they're both dealing with that confession. It's a period where the focus is on the self. I think what you find is that confessional mode has gone on and on. The thing is, what of the confessional is poetry, that we can use. It's here. I suppose it's here to stay. In that sense, I think that that period of suicide, madness, etc., has passed. But you still have, I don't know, a lot of poetry that just says, I've got to spill the beans. But is it interesting? Is it worthy of being read? That's a difficult question. How much of it is there? I suppose then there is the confessional in the Catholic sense as well, but there's a sense in that world of the confessional in which what you confess to is to, I think, make a realization of who we are as human beings, and then how we might be able to change. What can we leave behind of value for others? So very often I find that aspect missing in a lot of the words. It's just, woe is me, woe is me, woe is me. But I think in a good confessional poem, it could point to something. This is what happened to me, but look where was God in it? Where was God in it? What did I learn from this? And in a secular age, that gets harder and harder.
Right. Well, that was clearly a question that Lowell had stopped asking. And it's sort of interesting to think what his poetry might have been like if he hadn't stopped asking that question. Well, Paul, thank you so much for coming on and for talking to us about Lowell.
Well, thank you, Jen. It was a pleasure.
You have been listening to Sacred and Profane Love, a philosophy, theology, and literature podcast that is generously underwritten by the Institute for Human Ecology at the Catholic University of America and produced by Catholics for Hire, a group of young Catholic digital content freelancers. Special thanks goes to Will Dethridge, Bea Kwazai, and Joe Coleman for their work in editing and producing this podcast. If you enjoy this podcast, please consider supporting us by giving us a positive review on iTunes or by becoming a monthly patron. Just go to www.patreon.com/eudaimoniapod. Patrons enjoy many benefits like tote bags and coffee mugs with exclusive artwork and a free digital subscription to either The Lamp or The Point magazines. For our next episode, I will be joined by the historian Christopher Snyder to discuss Tolkien's fiction and Aristotelian virtue ethics. Until then, friends, be well and keep reading.